Hey guys, it's Coach Goodrich here with another 8th grade American history lecture video. This is going to be Unit 6, Part 1. We're going to split this up into 3 different sections. You got Antebellum, Civil War, and then Reconstruction. Bear in mind that some of these images you see are going to be a little disturbing, like the one on the lower right, but I care about you guys too much not to tell you the truth and not to show you these things the way that I see them. So get your paper ready. Your packet ready, hopefully it's printed out, ready to go, and here we go. Number 1, essential questions. How did slavery and the abolition movement contribute to the Civil War? And number 2, what were the failures and successes of federal Reconstruction? You can pause the video here so you can write these down, and we'll be answering these as we move throughout the unit. When you're ready, press play. The peculiar institution. Thomas Jefferson is quoted as saying, "Slavery is like holding a wolf by the ears. You cannot control it, but you sure do not let it go." And I would agree with him in that regard. The first Africans arrived in Jamestown in 1619 as indentured servants, serving for 7 years on average. Gradually, this would become a more open form of slavery called chattel slavery, which is a movable, chattel or chattel is a movable type of personal property. You would see prices up to $2,000 per slave right before the Civil War. By 1860, 4 million slaves in the United States, and half of the 14 million Southerners were either a slave or a member of a slave-holding family, so a large percentage of the population. And you can see this here. You can pause this video and get a little breakdown of the combination between whites, slaves, and free blacks. King Cotton, cash crops in America. So we had tobacco, started in Jamestown, back in Unit 2. From 1619 to the mid-1700s. You can have rice in South Carolina and Georgia from the mid-1700s to early 1800s, and you're going to have cotton in the deep South. We're talking Louisiana, Alabama, Mississippi, from the early to mid-1800s. By 1835, cotton was king, with Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama as the top producers. A bale of cotton, just a little fun fact, weighs 480 pounds, which would make 215 pair of jeans, 249 bed sheets, 1,200 dress sheets, 3,000 diapers, and 300,000 $100 bills. Yes, we call it paper. It's not really paper. It's more of like paper with a lot of cotton mixed in there. Cotton fields. If you're driving through South Georgia anytime soon, especially during the fall, you'll see this. And we have examples of cotton gins made by Eli Whitney, a small personal one, a much larger one, and then of course the modern John Deere version. By 1860, we're making almost 4 million bales of cotton every year. And you can see that there is a correlational relationship between cotton production and slave production. More cotton, more slaves you need to pick it. So that's almost 1-to-1 even on that. Plantation system. While often represented in the media, like Tara in the very famous old movie Gone with the Wind, plantations and their owners actually made up a very small minority of the total Southern population. However, they did control most of the wealth, and because of that, they were the most powerful forces in Southern politics, like in the Senate and House of Representatives. These plantations would have several hundred slaves and would act as their own cities, self-sufficient. They'd have their own churches, their own shoemakers, their own carpenters, their own blacksmiths, so they would very rarely have to go off of their own campuses. We'll watch that trailer later. Some of the more famous ones in history include Mount Vernon, which is George Washington's home, and Monticello, which is Thomas Jefferson's home. Your typical setup. The plantation system. So typically your slaves would be designed and split up to work in one of two ways, either the task system or the gang system. The task system was the much better way to go about it in terms of being easier and actually like having some sort of decency about you. Each slave was assigned a job to do each day. He was then free to do as he pleased when he got his job done. The gang system, which is what most of them would eventually adopt, is much more cruel. An overseer, a slave that has been promoted, assigned groups of slaves to work under drivers who were also slaves. Hours were usually from daybreak to sundown, and you just worked all day. Normal field slaves on a cotton plantation were expected to pick 150 to 200 pounds of cotton a day. ate what is now considered soul food, leftovers from the owners, such as pig feet, hog maw, oxtails, collards. They fried everything to make it taste good. It has a huge, even today, a huge impact on Southern cuisine, on Southern food. You usually have single-room housing with earthen floors, one set of clothes for winter and one for summer. Fewer than 4 out of every 100, so less than 4%, lived up to the age of 60, and families were split up systematically. Some of the more famous slave revolts. Some of these, one of them we've already talked about. You have Gabriel Prosser's Plain Revolt in Richmond, Virginia, in 1800. Plain rebellion, but was delayed by a violent storm, allowing time for the plans to be discovered. Prosser was hung later after he was caught. The German Coast uprising along the Mississippi River, right above New Orleans in 1811. This is the largest slave uprising in American history, with anywhere from 200 to 500 slaves, but it was put down very violently by the local militias. And then Nat Turner in Hampton County, Virginia, in 1831. He was a slave preacher who led a group of escaped slaves into killing 57 whites over a 2-week period before he was captured and hung. This is definitely the most famous or infamous, depending on how you're looking at it. So, Gabriel Prosser, German Coast, and then Nat Turner's on the right. The Underground Railroad system of lines, paths, and roads and stations, safe houses, used by escaped slaves and their guides to reach freedom in the North. No, it was not an actual train that ran underground. They're just code words. That led to the passage of the Fugitive Slave Laws of 1793 and 1850, which made harboring an escaped slave a federal crime, as well as rewarding those for returning escaped slaves. This also led to the Gag Rule of 1836, which forbade talking about slavery during sessions of Congress. Examples of the reward posters. And then the various little stations and cities and routes to leave from the south all the way to the north. Actually, Florida has a startling reputation as being a place where people would go, especially South Florida, into the swamps, because nobody wanted to follow them down that way. Harriet Tubman was the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. She was nicknamed the Moses of her people. She made 19 trips, saved 300 people. She bragged that she was never caught and never lost one passenger. This is going to be a proposed statue of Harriet Tubman that's going to be put up in her hometown in Maryland. Some of the different hiding places, false bottoms in wells and in basements, little outhouses hidden everywhere. All right, the abolition movement. We've talked about this already, but let's rehash on it. Are all men created equal? So you're going to have Benjamin Lundy, who's a Quaker from Pennsylvania, who wrote The Genius of Universal Emancipation. William Lloyd Garrison, publisher of the Liberator magazine, founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society. You got Harriet Beecher Stowe, author of Uncle Tom's Cabin, national bestseller, which describes firsthand the brutality of slavery. Paul Cuff, a wealthy Northern African American, favored returning to Africa. And Frederick Douglass, of course, we talked about, escaped slave turned writer and speaker. All right, into the big ones that we got about 5 minutes to do it. So here we go. We're going to have a total of 4 major congressional debates over slavery, really to limit the expansion of it. Let's talk about it. First one, Missouri Compromise, 1820. Missouri applied for statehood in 1818 as a slave state. The problem? There are currently 11 free states and 11 slave states. Adding one more slave state would throw off the balance of power in Congress. Solution, Missouri is going to be added as a slave state, and Maine will be added as a free state from Massachusetts to keep the balance. Also, the 3630 parallel, or line of latitude, becomes the established line that separates the free North from the slave South, and Henry Clay guided the bill through Congress. So there. Everything underneath would be slave. Everything over top would be free, except for Missouri. That was the exception. Lines of latitude run laterally. Remember that. Next one, 25 years later. The Wilmot Proviso, 1846. After annexing the lands won in the West during the Mexican-American War, the question of slave versus free was reignited. David Wilmot of Pennsylvania wanted to prohibit slavery in these regions as they became states. After being defeated in the Senate, new ideas of controlling the spread of slavery were deemed necessary, and this would pave the way for what is called popular sovereignty, which is a fancy way of saying the people get to vote, the people decide. The people's right to vote to decide for themselves whether their state would be slave or free. You see, out in the West was where that was tried to put into effect. Compromise of 1850. California was being considered for entrance into the Union as a free state, once again threatening to upset the balance of power between slave and free states. President Millard Fillmore signs the bill into law with the following adjustments. Number 1, California will be admitted as a free state. Number 2, the territories of Utah and New Mexico will be subject to popular sovereignty, so they'll get to vote to decide. Number 3, Texas would receive $10 million for the land that was given up. And number 4, Washington, D.C. would prohibit the slave trade itself, but not slavery. And it's going to be organized by Henry Clay as well. This is a good look at the map after the Compromise of 1850. And then the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. The Missouri Compromise is repealed. We're doing good. Once again, opening the slave versus free state debate. The 36-30 parallel line that was established during the Missouri Compromise is abolished. Kansas and Nebraska are given statehood under the principle of popular sovereignty. Stephen Douglas of Illinois introduced the bill. John Brown, an abolitionist, organized an uprising against the slaveholders throughout the area. And in response to this, with atrocities committed by both sides, and would later become known as Bleeding Kansas, thanks to this. That's the last of our congressional acts. Because Nebraska Act affected these two spots. And the Missouri Compromise line, like we said, was done away with. Let's get into a Supreme Court decision. The Dred Scott decision of 1857. Dred Scott was a slave that was taken by his master from Missouri, a slave state, to Illinois, a free state, where he promptly escaped. After being caught, he sued his master in the federal court, stating that he should be free, eventually making it to the Supreme Court. He should be free because he escaped in a free state. Chief Justice Roger Taney handed down a very despicable decision. Number 1, Scott could not sue because he was not an American citizen, but property. And number 2, the federal government cannot take away property rights from the owners without due cause. This is a huge step backwards for our country. Dred Scott and Roger Taney. John Brown, the guy from Bleeding Kansas in 1859. He was a famous, or infamous, depending on how you viewed him, abolitionist. John Brown had taken part in several instances of hostility versus pro-slavery supporters. Bleeding Kansas, he was really a preacher, but he was really crazy, very fundamentalist, and kind of a psychopath. Maybe for the right reason, but still crazy. Convinced that all slaves should revolt against their masters, he set out to arm them with weapons. In order to do that, he needed to find some weapons, so he organized an attack on the Federal Arsenal, or Weapons House, in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It was a disaster, and Brown was later captured by Robert E. Lee, who was stationed there. Remember the name, Robert E. Lee. He would be tried, convicted, and executed, becoming a martyr for the cause of abolition. Now we're going to break down these photos here a little bit later on in class, but pay attention to them. This one too. And now let's talk about the most famous person from this time period in the 30 seconds we have left. Abraham Lincoln, my favorite president. Born in rural Kentucky in 1809, he lived in several log cabins throughout the state in Illinois. He's a self-educated lawyer and shopkeeper, suffered various personal tragedies and political defeats throughout his life, won national fame during his campaign for Senate versus Stephen Douglas, which he would end up losing, and his anti-slavery stance in 1858. But 2 years later, defeats Douglas, John C. Breckinridge, and John Bell for President of the United States during the 1860 election in a landslide margin. There's a voting map right there, and a young Abe Lincoln. And now it is up to him to try and save the Union, try to patch up the North and the South. Alright guys, mini quiz. Go ahead and answer this on your own paper and on Google Classroom, and I really look forward to discussing this with you, especially the photos, a little bit later on. Appreciate you guys. See you guys soon.